English translation. 524th contact Saturday, the 30th of July 2011, 14:45 hours.
I have just closed my temple because you said yes during the correction work. You will be here punctually at 14:45 HRS. Quetzal was already here in the late hours of the morning because he is otherwise busy this afternoon.
That is what I said, yes, and now is exactly that time. It was necessary for me to do something in my flying apparatus for the last 45 minutes. Quetzal is actually busy this afternoon with some important work, so we had to come here not together, but each of us at a different time.
All right, but that is not supposed to be an excuse, or?
No, it was simply a statement of fact.
Can I ask you something right away, or is there something you want to bring up first?
You can bring up your question.
Actually, I could have asked you a long time ago, but until a fortnight ago, I was not interested. What is it actually like for you when the human beings grow old? In our civilized countries, we have old people's homes for the elderly, and old people in need of care are looked after in so-called nursing homes. Unfortunately, various such old people's homes and nursing homes are often in catastrophic conditions because the human beings are harassed, neglected, or even abused and financially excluded. For decades now, such miserable conditions have been reported time and again, also that old humans are simply killed by nursing staff.
These terrible and inhuman events are known to me. But to your question, when the human beings become elderly, they remain vital until old age and continue to spend their lives in their own homes. However, if they have any difficulties in this respect, it is our custom that they are taken in by their children and that they are provided with their own premises in which they can live and do whatever they want at their own discretion. Their descendants are also concerned about them and all the things that come up, so that they do not suffer any hardship, problems, or worries. If there are no descendants, the elderly who need help are taken in and cared for by blood relatives or friends. If all this is not possible, then what you call a home for the elderly comes into its own, where the human beings can do whatever they want, but are also cared for. We do not have people in need of care because the human beings remain healthy until the very old age, because no diseases appear in such a way that a need for care in old age would arise. Of course, we have a very highly developed medicine which prevents diseases from breaking out and therefore neutralizes them, even if only one single germ appears. Our medical developments and knowledge, as well as our diagnostic techniques, are so highly developed that in fact, a single germ or a harmful physical factor can be detected at the onset of a disease or a physical ailment and then completely cured, etc., before a disease or a physical ailment can arise.
Your average age is 1,050 years, which I suppose is only a certain number of the population. That is also the way it is calculated here on Earth. This means that naturally with you, human beings also die at a much younger age, as is also the case with us. But what interests me now is this: what causes the human beings to die at a much younger age? Here on the Earth, diseases, misfortunes, violence, murders, capital punishment, wars, and terrorism, etc., play the most decisive role for an earlier death.
That is correct, but with us, these factors do not arise when we ignore possible accidents, which unfortunately cannot be avoided despite the best safety measures. What must be taken into account, however, is the fact that every human being, from a purely physical point of view, has a certain life expectancy that is predetermined. This is inherited over many generations, so that, based on the long history of the family tree, the probable age of the human being can be calculated quite accurately, according to the age of the different ancestors on the mother's and father's side.
But how is it then that with general progress and the development of medicine, food production, and technology, as is the case here on Earth, the average age of the human being is increasing?
This corresponds to a natural development. But it ends when the highest possible age is reached, because when genetically the peak of the possibility of aging is reached, then no further life expectancy is possible. This is also the case with us. Therefore, only a certain number of human beings reach the high average age of 1,050 years.
I see, then life expectancy is very different according to the people and the human beings, and is also finite, so that there is no eternal life in physical form. What can be eternal and outlast all times only refers to the spirit energetic, and therefore also to the spirit form that animates the human being, which in the end, however, undergoes a change, and as we spirit energy is classified into higher levels and becomes a purely spirit energetic form, which no longer needs a material human consciousness for development. Eternal life in another sense does not exist. The genes, etc., also determine the human being's age as well as the progress and development of medicine and food, etc., and their use. A healthy lifestyle, the affirmation and protection of life, etc., also play a major role in my opinion. Those who carelessly risk their lives, such as adrenaline addicts, daredevils, and others who are tired of life, is of course without a chance of a long life.
It is as you say.
I am now interested in the story of Jack the Ripper. According to the 467th Contact Conversation of the 28th of June 2008, Volume 11, page 373, you declared the following.
It seems that there was a private conversation about why there is no record of it. At any rate, I know nothing about such an official conversation. But concerning Jack the Ripper, it is without doubt to say that he was a man who was addicted to a degenerated sexuality, which he fulfilled in prostitutes in order to murder them, for which he used a dagger, but also a small sword and poison. He also took organs from the dead, which he cooked and ate. He was born in Canada, lived for some time in the USA, and then in England. The man's name was Thomas Neal Cream, and he was a trained physician, but after several murders he came under suspicion, was arrested, charged, and sentenced to death, after which he was hanged in 1892. At the same time, however, a second man was at work in the same way, who went to the royal house of Queen Victoria, but was never caught because he managed to evade justice and stopped his bloody activities after Thomas Neal Cream was arrested.
Now, I would like to ask you, which person was it that prosecuted the Queen Victoria royal family and murdered the prostitute?
It was a grandson of the Queen, Prince Albert Victor, who murdered prostitutes because he secretly courted with them and then feared that they would publicly discredit him.
By he courted with them, do you mean that he was their suitor and had love affairs with them?
That is the meaning of my words.
Your use of the word is somewhat unusual, because men who go to prostitutes for sexual gratification are usually called suitors nowadays. However, this should not be associated with the dignified marrying respectively courting of a girl or a woman for the purpose of wooing a bride. A suitor, according to your so-called wooing, refers to the sex-related freedom of a customer towards a prostitute or a hustler.
Then I have misused the word.
The word is correct in itself, but it is no longer common in today's language. But tell me, do you know what's coming up regarding the debt crisis in the USA? Will an agreement or a compromise between the Republicans and the Democrats be reached? If I think about all the fuss that is being made over there, the Republicans are just mouthing off and terrorizing the Democrats because they want to remove President Obama from office. But I think that can be a real problem, because if the power-hungry and domineering Republicans, who are somehow not quite correct in their minds, do not give in, then the world financial world and the world economy will crash.
We are also interested in the whole thing, which is why we have made various forays into the future, and why we have seen that in the last 3 days a compromise has been reached, and the great financial disaster has been averted. On the one hand, this will be done by raising the debt ceiling by several $trillion and by implementing a small austerity program. The whole thing is absolutely ridiculous, because this compromise does not solve the problem, because simply by raising the debt limit, printing and circulating more money, and making small savings, this does not change anything. The problems still exist, and they can only be solved by radical and far-reaching measures. And consequently, there is still the threat of public finance and economic collapse, worldwide and in all probability. We have not yet figured out what is actually happening. But one thing is certain. The crisis is continuing, not only in the United States, but also in the dictatorial European Union and in other countries around the world. Radical action would have to be taken to change everything for the better and lead to a development that would solve all the problems.
But the USA is not capable of this, nor is the EU and many other states, because the majority of the rulers and other responsible parties are not capable of keeping a good budget, as is unfortunately also the case with most other states and rulers worldwide. If a state's financial management was correct, there should not be any national debt, but rather a certain financial cushion to the contrary. Unfortunately, however, the exact opposite is the case, because all those in positions of responsibility in governments, etc., who have to manage public finances are only out to run up debts and squander the money en masse. This is also the case in Switzerland, as the past has shown. I am thinking of Finance Minister Merz, who saved a huge amount of money in the national budget that could have been used to reduce debt. Unfortunately, when he was not re-elected, others, including other parties, took the helm, and they immediately screamed for more spending, so that the savings were immediately squandered. The point of all of them is that it is not their own money that they are wasting, but the taxpayers' money, so they themselves do not suffer any damage. And the kicker is that financially strong companies and the wealthy are given tax breaks, while the working people have to bear the heaviest tax burdens. The real question is where equality for all is to be found. The working class has to pay more and more taxes, such as state and value-added taxes, etc., which makes it more and more difficult or even impossible for many people to live a sensible and carefree life, while the financially strong, like the rich, practically get away with a sandwich of taxes. Unfortunately, it is also the case that the state is taken as a model by the people when it comes to getting into debt. And consequently, the state imitates the principle of state debt mania and debt addiction, and also lives on a large scale and becomes increasingly insolvent, even to the point of private bankruptcy. And what basically drives the states into horrendous debt is, on the one hand, the expenditure for the military and its armament, and on the other hand, for the entire civil service, administrative and governmental apparatus, which is completely overstaffed in practically every state, and, in addition, devours vast sums of money as a result of horrendous and unjustifiably high salaries, which have to be paid by the taxpayers. The postponement of ailing government bonds in the form of debentures is also part of governmental financial mismanagement. But it is also the case that institutions and state organizations, etc., are created. Nonsensical associations, cultural workers and companies, etc., are supported, and buildings, etc., are constructed, which also demand vast sums of money that can only be spent if debts are incurred. This is in my home country, Switzerland, as well as in all other countries of the world. When I think that Italy has a debt of around 1.8 trillion, 1,800 billion euros, and Germany more than 3 trillion euros, I am horrified to see what the future holds for Europe and the world. To my knowledge, Switzerland has only about 130 billion francs in debt, but every franc is also too much. But if you take the United States, with its 14 trillion in debt to date, and China alone owes around 1.3 trillion, 1,300 billion dollars, then I am told that the United States of America has reached the end of its world power ambitions and will, sooner or later, have to cede this position to the newly emerging China and abandon its lying world democratization plans, which the former 28th President of the United States of America has so far been unable to fulfill. U.S. President Thomas Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed at the time of the First World War, but he also wanted to achieve this goal by force, war, and terror. The truth is that the United States has not really been a world democratizer, but has undoubtedly been committed to world domination and control through evil violence. Wars, mass murder, destruction, etc. This is connected with the worldwide spread of the infant language English, with which it is also impossible to produce a single reasonable sentence. As with Napoleon Bonaparte, the idea of the US president was to bring about a democratization of the whole world, which of course meant, with a warlike background, that the end justifies the means. Under the guise of this idea of global democratization, the US has since then waged wars and murderous and intriguing intelligence operations around the world, committing and continuing to commit atrocities and war and intelligence crimes and destruction. Torture of the worst kind and insidious killings and official executions are also part of these degenerate atrocities, as are assassinations and mass murders in many forms. The way the USA has acted and continues to act has also been done since ancient times by other world powers, be it ancient China, Egypt, Carthage, Rome, England or Russia and the former Soviet Union, etc., but they all lost their position of world power. And the reasons for this were always and without exception the same: military, ideological, political, and economic, and in some cases also religious. All the past empires collapsed because they had too much land, colonies, districts and provinces, etc. Too much military, too much armament, and too much administrative apparatus, which ruined them financially, overtaxed their economies, acted politically wrongly, and followed destructive ideologies. And it must also be said that when world powers come to the point where they have to seek help and assistance and cooperation from other states for warfare and for the economy, etc., as the USA did with the war in Iraq and the disaster in Afghanistan, it is the beginning of the end of an autonomous state. In all of this, when state expenditure exceeds income and debts are incurred, a state makes itself dependent on those other states with whom it is in debt. This dependence on other states and their economies also arises when a country does not have enough of its own resources and does not have its own and sufficient food production. If there is not enough food in a country, then a stink arises, and this usually leads to civil war, which then eats up and destroys the state from within. The same problem arises with energy, especially oil today. The USA alone is probably the biggest energy consumer in this respect and is more dependent on oil than any other country. The US cannot produce enough of the black gold at home, and therefore has to purchase huge quantities from other countries. The US has oil reserves for only 3 months, and if these are used up and not replenished, then the whole infrastructure collapses. Industry and commerce, the military, the food supply, the operation of hospitals, and so on. When I look at the United States and the many acts of war it has waged and continues to wage, the big-mouthness of the state is clear to see for how many wars it has lost and how much worse it has made things much worse than they were before it intervened. One need only think of the more recent period when the 2 Bushes with the US military raged in Iraq, spreading endless death, torture, torment, misery, and misery that still continues today. Clinton and other US presidents were also no better, with only the atrocities in Vietnam being mentioned. Like the past, so is the present and the future, but the USA still does not understand that its power is over and that in its state the addiction to debt is driving everything to ruin, from which such enormous damage has already been caused financially, economically, politically, ideologically, and religiously sectarian, and which can hardly be repaired, if at all. And this has been done in the USA for centuries, with the worst forms of damage being conjured up from the First World War into the 3rd millennium by completely war-loving and absolutely incapable presidents. The success of this is that all the US behavior and its desire for world domination has given rise to an international terrorism which is clearly US fault and which nothing really effective can yet counter. The incredibly ridiculous big-mouthness of the United States, which Germany and other countries are also joining, cannot be used to combat terrorism, as is also shown by the ridiculous measures taken in respect of Libya, Yemen, Egypt, and Syria. And what the US has done since time immemorial, and what is now emerging as a consequence, is now innocently being made the scapegoat of President Barack Obama and held responsible for everything. He now has to pay for everything, for which he is unjustifiably accused of incapacity by his power-hungry opponents, and by all the stupid and primitive people who cry along with the power-hungry. The whole thing is not about getting the USA back on its feet and strengthening the country. It is just about allowing power-hungry people to make their mark and get the presidency. And once they have achieved this, they disregard what Obama wants to achieve or wanted to achieve for the present and the future, respectively, in order to continue in the old power-hungry, destructive in state and humanity and life-despising métier, as their predecessors did, some of whom must be called criminals and felons in particular, because they brought millions of deaths to earthly humanity with wars and revolutions that they instigated and had carried out all over the world. If I want to express my opinion further, I have to say that the United States is completely obsolete in terms of politics, military, religion, sects, ideology, legislation, culture, and ecology. A fundamentally outdated system of government has brought about a standstill in state power. But there is also a rejection of a thorough social, political, ideological, and cultural change to progressive changes and developments, so that nothing new and valuable can emerge and establish itself from which great and positive things and values can emerge. The USA is also far away from the majority of all states with regard to ecological problems, respectively, the interrelationships between the human being, all living beings, and the environment, respectively, the budget of nature, as well as the climate. The same thing also happened to all other world powers, which ultimately had to give up their positions of world power. This is how I see things.
A long speech, dear friend, but I have to say that you have given the true facts.
Some squibs will probably say that I am meddling in politics again.
A free and correct and justified expression of opinion based on clear and true facts has not anything to do with politics.
I know, Ptah, but envious opponents and pathologically stupid know-it-alls, or those who are themselves affected, will not agree.
That will certainly be the case.
Then something else. If Barbara has finished the book of names so far that it can be corrected, then it is not possible for me to do it alone, so one of you has to help me. I was thinking of Florina and Anjana, who are both here all the time. Is it possible that both of them can help me, both of them or Florina or Anjana, ever alternating and depending on the demand?
That can be arranged, and I will immediately make the necessary arrangements in your preferred way for either Florina or Anjana to be on demand for the correction work. Both together cannot be called away from their duties, as these must always be performed by one person.
Understood. It is important that someone helps me, because I cannot do the work alone, because I do not know how to spell and emphasize the individual names correctly.
Anjana and Florina can always refer back to the relevant data, so the whole of the corrections can be done very accurately.
This was unfortunately not the case with the first edition of the name book, so there were still errors of emphasis and other errors, which must now be avoided. But if you still have some time to answer one last question.
What is it about?
In the Contact Reports Volume No. 6, on pages 11, 14, there is a record of a conversation between Quetzal and I on the 230th Contact Report of Wednesday, the 11th of October, 1989. The conversation was about cosmic radiation, which causes climate and weather effects on Earth. What interests me now is the following. In my opinion, the cloud formations on Earth are influenced by the sun as much as by cosmic rays, which cause climate influences. So I guess that the sun's radiation also influences the clouds on Earth, which in turn influences the climate and weather. In my opinion, this is logical and natural, but I am not clear whether or to what extent the sun's influence on the Earth's clouds can have anything to do with global warming and climate change. By and large, I think that it is probably only Earth humans with their overpopulation and all their unnatural varieties who are to blame for the blatant climate change.
The percentage of the sun's influence on the clouds of the Earth is, of course, just as much a fact as cosmic radiation. However, neither of these factors is the reason for the earthly climate change, but without doubt, the earthly humanity must be responsible for it. The sun's radiation is within the natural range and does not create an extraordinary influence with regard to the clouds and the climate in the way that the latter has been extremely adversely affected, disturbed and even destroyed by Earth humans.
That's what I wanted to know. Thanks.
Then this should end our conversation. Goodbye, Edward, my friend.
See you next time. Farewell and goodbye, Ta, dear friend.